Every time a kid gets killed, we know them and we know what happened. And we know them because they are the most active criminal offenders in the city. Gang members do not hide, they're not operating undercover, they're out there, we're out there, we know them by name. When they get killed, we don't have to look them up in the record management system. We know who they are. We generally know their older brothers, their younger brothers. Pretty often we know their parents. We know who they're fighting with, we know who they're running with. There aren't that many of them. There aren't that many gangs, there aren't that many gang members. They're all dealing drugs. So this was the day of literal street corner drug markets across the country, and these guys were standing out in broad daylight selling crack to passing cars. So everybody's making money on the street, and almost none of the violence is about money. They are killing each other over respect and disrespect and girls and what for the first time we heard, beef. Standing vendetta between these groups can go back and forth for years, Hatfield and McCoy kind of thing. And they said, we nearly always know what happened. So if you look at the clearance rate for the homicide unit or the DA's office, it's pathetic. Very few of these cases are getting prosecuted. But that's about being able to get a fact pattern to the prosecutor. That's not about whether we know what happened. We know what happened almost every single time. And the dark joke in the gang unit, and it was a joke, they didn't mean it, right? But the joke was, if we could take out life insurance on some of these kids, everybody in the unit could retire early with a house and a boat. We know that much about what's happening. I did not believe them, right? Everything that I had read, everything in the scholarship about the violence epidemic, none of it said anything about this. And to the extent that people were talking about gangs, it was this dismissive sort of thing. There's no such thing as a gang. You can't define it. A whole, group of people who have common symbols and wear colors and who battle with each other, that describes the NFL, ha, 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 right? So it's, whatever it is, it's definitely not gangs, right? That's what everybody in academia believed. And the dominant idea in scholarship at the time was that gun violence had become so prevalent in these communities that while it might have been brought in by crack dealers, now everybody was so afraid, everybody was getting strapped, everybody was carrying guns in self-defense, and the violence was diffusing, was the word, out of the core drug market world. None of that turned out to be right. Because when we did the research, and as academics we had the tools to do that, they were right and everybody else was wrong. The homicide problem in Boston, which they knew already, all we did was put some boundaries on it, was 61 drug crews operating largely in 3 Boston neighborhoods. It had at most 1,500 people in them. If you were a homicide victim or a homicide offender, in each case, 75% of you had prior criminal records. And if you were in the 75% and had at least 1 prior, on average, you had about 10 prior arrests. And remember, these are people all 24 and under. These were young people that we were looking at. Very extensive criminal records. The dominant mechanism that was driving the violence was these back and forth vendettas with respect to all this stuff clustered closely behind it. And of those 61 groups, we could for a fact associate 60% of all youth homicide with those groups. And that's a lower bound estimate. It was higher than that. We knew that, but unless we absolutely knew what was happening, we didn't say it belonged in the category. So suddenly this incredibly amorphous problem had distilled down to 61 groups whose names we know and 1,300 or so people whose names we know. And the gang officers and the street outreach workers and the street probation and parole officers we were working with all said, it's not even them. It's not really all 1,500, all 1,300. Every group has one or two people who really drive things, and they taught us to call them what they call them the impact players. But it's about a fifth of that small pool that is the impact players. That's what's really going on. So suddenly this is not the entire city or everybody who deals with gangster rap. It's 300 people. And that was, in fact, the truth on the ground. The second thing they said was, we know how to stop it. And what they meant by that, it turned out, was when one of these groups gets completely out of hand, we know how to bring them back to baseline. And they told us a story about a group on Wendover Street in Dorchester, Massachusetts. They had a guy who was running guns up from Mississippi. He was a college student down there. He straw purchased guns, consolidated them on school break. He put them in a gym bag, took the bus back up to Dorchester, sold the guns to all of his friends, and the whole place was going haywire. They tracked him down. ATF and the Boston Police Department put him in federal prison for quite a long time, Jose Andrade. The guns were still in the neighborhood, and the place was still going haywire. And they stopped it. And the way they stopped it was they knew what was going on. They knew that all these homicides and shots fired and drive-bys and stuff came back to this crew. Probably couldn't prosecute any of those cases, but they knew what was happening. And one evening, they went to a parking lot and had a face-to-face conversation with guys they knew in this crew. And on that evening, they said to them, you guys are the most off the hook in the city right now. Therefore, we are making you a special project. You guys sell drugs, use drugs, have outstanding warrants, are on probation and parole, have unpaid child support, drive unregistered cars, don't have insurance, don't have driver's licenses, have cases in the DA's pipeline that those ADAs aren't going to take that seriously, except we've just told them that they are. You have cases that could be reviewed by the US attorney, and you'll get fed time and go to South Dakota. And if nothing else, we're going to park a marked unit in your drug corner, and nobody's going to be dumb enough to buy while the cops are sitting there, and nobody's going to get arrested, but nobody's going to make any money, and nobody's going to have any fun. And the reason we are doing this is because you are shooting off the most guns in the city right now. We can't do this to all 61 groups all the time. You know that. You get away with almost everything you do, and it is the nature of being a high-rate offender that you get away with almost everything you do. We can't fix that for everybody in the city all of the time, but we're about to fix it for you. And the genius of what they did was that as they did that, they said to the group that evening and repeatedly, the reason we are doing this is because you are shooting people. This is about the guns and the violence. The drugs and the warrants and the unregistered cars and the probation supervision and the drug tests, we don't care about that. Your PO does, the district does. We're in the violence business. This is a conversation about violence. And if the violence stops, we will let things go back to normal, where you do what you do and we will do what we do, and sometimes you win and sometimes we win. But as long as you keep shooting guns, we win and you lose. And they kept this pressure up for a couple of weeks. They pulled every lever they could. This is where one of the original frames for this, it was called Pulling Levers Policing, because the fact that these guys are such high-rate offenders gives us levers to pull. And by the time they were done, these guys were so sick of not making any money and not having any fun. The BPD guys knew who was holding what guns by now. Everybody was flipping, everybody was talking. And the last move in this little dance was that the gang unit said to this crew, we're not going away until you turn your guns over. And the story ends with this crew filling brown paper shopping bags full of pistols and delivering them to the gang unit. They were so sick of this that they just wanted out from under. And when we heard this, now we have not very many groups, not very many people whose names we know who are driving the violence, and we have a way to control the violence. That is what became Operation Ceasefire in Boston. That is what generated this so-called Boston Miracle. If you've read the book, you know what I think about that term. It is the set of facts and ideas that have now led to all of this operational work, with some extras, because it wasn't just law enforcement. They had very street-savvy black ministers in there saying, this is wrong, you should knock it off, you're hurting your little brothers and sisters, you're hurting your community. They had street outreach workers in there, calming the beefs down, getting people into jobs and into programs. They would go talk to people's parents and say, get your son under control, he's either going to get killed or go to prison. We don't want any of that. But the core fact on the ground was that a very small, identifiable population was driving the violence, and that they, because of the way they behaved, turned out to be open to a kind of outreach and pressure, A, that the rest of us had never thought of, and B, if they were ordinary citizens, they wouldn't have been open to this, right? If they weren't driving unregistered cars and carrying guns and open to dirty urine tests for being on probation, you couldn't have done this, but they were, and you could. And the only thing that the Harvard team added to what became Ceasefire was the idea of the call-in, right? This was very good for shutting one group down, but Boston had 61 groups in it, right? This wasn't going to change the city. And so what we thought maybe you could do was, you look at the groups are all such frequent flyers criminally that every group typically on any given day has somebody on probation and parole. We get probation and parole to bring those people into this room, and we say to them, we know who you are, we know what you're doing, your community wants you to stop, there's an option for you, we would like you to take the social services that we've arranged for you, and when you go out of here, the first group that kills somebody is going to get the same attention this last group got. When you leave here, go back and tell the guys you run with, we don't want to be the first person in Boston to kill somebody, because they can do this, they're going to come toward us, don't do it. And this very penny ante kind of game theory in this was, if that communication was right, if everybody believed it, then nobody wants to be the first group and you've stopped everybody. So we tried it and it worked. It's not perfect, it never has been, but in Boston, there were 2 meetings and 2 crackdowns, and the entire city changed. And that is the beginning of, you've all seen these evaluation results, 2/3 reduction in youth violence homicide. That got better over time, now replicated in all sorts of places. And what I'm now going to do is, 20 years later, we've begun to figure out what we were really up to, right? On this, the practice greatly was greatly in advance of the underlying logic, of the theory, of the application of any of the different academic fields that have taught about things like group dynamics and deterrence and effective social support and collective efficacy and all that sort of stuff. This began with this kind of Hail Mary pass on the ground in Boston that worked dramatically better than anybody had any right to expect it to. And as we have spent more time with this, as the ceasefire framework, which we now call the group violence intervention, has moved around in different settings, as we have tried to map this basic logic onto other issues like drug markets and larceny and domestic violence, something has emerged that begins to be a very simple structure to how to do this kind of work. And that is what I will now walk through with you. Thoughts, questions, anything at this point? So it has turned out that for a whole bunch of serious public safety problems, you get this phenomenon where a very small number of exceptional people do most of the action. The gang issue, and we don't talk about gangs anymore. What one city thinks is a gang is not what another city thinks is a gang, is not what the FBI thinks is a gang. It doesn't matter what we call it. In every city with a major homicide and gun violence problem, that problem is driven by groups of high-rate offenders. And now, after decades of looking at cities and identifying those groups and counting up how many people are in them, in every city that we or anybody else has ever done this work, everybody in all the groups together adds up to less than 0.5% of the city, and they are connected with typically 60 to 75% of all homicide. It seems now to be a basic arithmetic truth. It's just the way the streets work. People are doing this in other settings now internationally and outside of civil war and genocide and that kind of thing. Kind of ordinary street violence, that's what you get. It's usually actually under 0.5%. It's typically closer to 0.3%, and the considerable preponderance of the homicide. When you look at other issues, you find very often the same kind of lopsided concentration. When we moved on to drug markets, most street drug markets, they can be active enough so they're tearing the guts out of an entire community. But there will only be 10 or 20 or 30 young men who will actually stand out in public or stand behind the door of a crack house and sell drugs to strangers. They may be hurting 10,000 people in the neighborhood, but there aren't that many of them. The best research on rape we have is in college populations, because that's a setting where one can do the survey work. And in this moment nationally where there is more and more and more talk about rape culture, what the research says is exactly the opposite. That almost no men on a college campus will rape anybody, and that where one will, there is a very small population of repeat offenders who do 90% of all sexual assault. When cities do analyses of misdemeanor arrestees, you get the same kind of thing. Most of us will never get arrested. A few of us will get arrested 500 times over the course of our lives. And we used to say, there are problems like this and there are problems that are not like this, right? So some things fit this pattern, but some things don't. So let's talk about speeding. Speeding is not a problem like this, right? Everybody speeds, right? This is the exact opposite of gang members shooting each other. And then we began to think, yes and no. So yes, in that everybody speeds, but my work, the National Network's work, actually really isn't about crime. I run something called the Center for Crime Prevention and Control, and I then have to say, I'm not really interested in crime, which is not really right because we all are. But what I'm interested in is communities. And there can be a lot of crime in communities without there being actually all that much community damage. Right? I was drawn to this stuff because in Watts in 1985, what was going on the street made it absolutely impossible for communities to function. People were afraid to go outside. We all know that there's no marijuana in suburban white high schools. Right? Just like to see if people are paying attention. There's lots of dope in lots of places, but they're not afraid to go outside. Nobody's getting shot. Nobody's babies are getting put to bed at night in the bathtubs for fear of stray gunshots. There actually aren't that many kinds of, there's lots of crime in lots of places. There aren't that many situations where what we call crime will make it impossible for a community to function. And if you go back to speeding, yeah, we all speed. But we speed with respect and civility, right? We look out for each other. We don't tailgate. We don't put each other at risk. We're actually very respectful offenders when it comes to speeding. And those few people who are at 50 over rather than 20 over and are tailgating and weaving in and out of traffic, the rest of us chronic offenders don't like them, right? So speeding kind of is like this other stuff. And when the lens that we're using isn't crime, but those things that really damage communities, maybe kind of everything has this distribution. Certainly lots of things do. So this basic concentration is central, and maybe it's not universal, not really sure about that. It's very common. And it seems to be common for most of the most serious crime issues that we've got. Thoughts, questions, reflections, anything?
Sounds like the homeless problem.
It's exactly the homeless problem. Has anybody read Malcolm Gladwell's piece, $1 Million Murray? You have, right. The homeless world discovered this, rather the homeless policy world discovered this 10 years ago. There are it turns out there are two classes of homeless. There are folks more or less like us who lose our jobs or flee an abusive husband or fall off the wagon or something like that. We will be homeless, we will recover, we will not be homeless for that long. And it's a terrible thing, but it's not chronic. There's a very small population of homeless who are dual diagnosis and won't take their meds and spend their lives on the street, and ordinary interventions don't work for them. They will not be okay without something special. And $1 Million Murray was in Denver. He's $1 million because when the team working on him put their heads together and did the analysis, he was costing the state of Colorado $1 million a year, which meant it made sense to buy him a nurse and an apartment. It did. It's cheaper. And it worked better. That's what, this was the beginning of a revolution in homelessness. My favorite thing about $1 Million Murray is that he was so chronic. He was getting arrested so often and getting hurt and having to detox and stuff, that one of the team that finally figured this out got married because he was a cop and she was an ER nurse, and they met because Murray kept going to the hospital. Okay, so now we have this small population. If we're doing law enforcement, we want them to know that the next time they do this thing, there will be a meaningful consequence. And when you have groups who at 24 are averaging 10 prior arrests and are still doing what they're doing, obviously our normal work with them is not creating any kind of meaningful certainty. So one wishes to come up with some kind of scheme that creates that. And ordinary law enforcement won't work, right? What we've been trying to do for 50 years in this country is to create certainty just by processing more people, giving them higher sentences. That is what has gotten us where we are, and it's not working, and now we know that it actually can make things worse. So we want to create certainty in a different way. And it turns out that there are lots of ways to do that. The ceasefire mechanism, we've got 61 groups. We can't respond to every group that does a shooting. If we say we do, we're what George Kelling calls woofing. These guys do what they do because people woof at them, right? These guys have spent their entire lives having their probation officer say, the next time you test dirty, I'm going to arrest you. The judge says, the next time you're in my court, I'm really going to throw the book at you. It doesn't happen. They learn not to listen. The deterrence literature calls this the experiential effect. The more crime you do, the more you learn that you're going to get away with it, and that when people tell you you're not, they're lying. So we need some other way to do things. You can't fix it just by working on arrest and prosecution. You fix it by doing kind of custom stuff for this limited population. And I see the cameras are out. Anybody who wants this PowerPoint will get it to you. So take any notes you want, but this is yours if you want it. So the way we solved the 61 group problem in Boston was this way of saying, by this way of saying, we're talking to you all on Monday. As of Tuesday morning, the first body that hits the ground, that's the group to which we are going. And if everybody knows that and believes it, then you've got all of their attention. It's not perfect, it does work. And this is kind of train a puppy stuff. You do it, somebody doesn't listen, you keep your promise, you pull them back in for the next call-in, you say, said it, meant it, gonna keep on doing this. If you make us, here's the guy who didn't listen, here's what happened to his group, very clear about what's going on here, you're free to go, but once again, we're waiting for the first group. Those of you who are parents, how many times have you told your kids anything just once, right? So this is the same sort of thing. What we actually say now in the call-ins is what we call the next group, worst group promise. We're going to go after the next group that kills somebody, and we're going to go after the worst group in the city. So you don't either want to be in the next group that commits a homicide, or the group that is doing the most killings and shootings and rapes and home invasions. There is going to be a price associated with being at the top of that list that you don't want to pay. And the game theory says on that is you can create a race to the bottom, right? But only if they know what's going on, right? This direct strategic communication is what makes this work. When we moved on to the drug markets, the question was, how do we let street drug dealers know that the next time they go on the corner and stand and sell drugs, they are going to go to jail? Peter Reuter and David Boyum, who are two of our best drug policy scholars, have done the calculation. What is the prison risk if you sell a unit of cocaine in the United States? What is the chance that you will go to prison? The answer turns out to be 1 in 15,000 transactions. Most of the time you don't get caught, it's a consensual crime. Most of the time when you do get caught, you don't go to prison, you get nalprost or probation or remanded or something like that. When you do get a bid, it's not usually a prison bid, doesn't count for very much. Hardly anybody goes to prison. And if you think we're tough on crime now, multiply that by 15,000 to create certainty for cocaine selling, and we're doomed. We turned it completely upside down. We did the investigations. You find the 30 people in this drug market. You get a documented controlled buy on each one, audio, video, the whole thing. And you go through the list. The genuinely violent folks do get arrested, right? They become the poster child for everybody else. But everybody else you bring in, you sit down, you find their mothers and their grandmothers, you dim the lights, you roll tape. And the tape is the DVD that you have made, which is one cocaine sale from each of them pulled from the undercover surveillance. And the second time we did this, ADA raised his hand and said, "Gentlemen, when you see yourself committing a felony, please raise your hand," right? And then you bring the lights back up and you say, "We're not charging you. We have cases ready to go on every single one of you, and we're not signing the warrant." This is about drug dealing in public. If we know you're running a crack house, if we know you're standing on the corner, we need no new evidence, no new investigations, no informants, no wiretaps. Here is your jacket. It contains the warrant. We sign the warrant. We walk out and pick you up. And the chance that you will go to jail if you are committing these sorts of overt drug acts just went to 100%. And because we're telling you ahead of time, now you know. And people who everybody said were psychotic and had no impulse control and didn't care if they lived or died and didn't care if they went to jail suddenly turned out to care a lot, and they didn't do it. We can say to people who've been arrested over and over and over and over again, There's a list with your name at the DA's office. And if you come in again, a bell is going to ring and they are going to take you to the wall. So don't do it. Those of you who were here this morning heard both Mark Kleiman and myself talk about this new idea in probation supervision. Used to be that if you were on probation, you would catch 15 violations each time. Your PO would say, don't do that again. Finally, she'd get tired, haul you in front of the judge and say, he's uncorrigible, send him back to prison. And the choice was between nothing and the rest of your sentence. What Swift, Certain, and Fair does is the judge says, every single time you violate, we will put you in jail for a day. That's it. No discussion, no discretion, nothing. That's what's going to happen. We want you to succeed. Here's all the support you're going to get. There will be no unpunished violations, but they're little. It's fantastically effective, and the new research on this says you don't even need the day. They're getting down to coming to your PO's office and sitting for an hour, and that seems to work just as well. So the classic deterrence theory says severity doesn't matter very much. Certainty matters enormously. Swiftness matters a lot. And we've gotten this stuff exactly wrong. We've put all of our money on severity and we've let certainty and swiftness go down the tubes. This turns it around and it's very effective. Again, thoughts, questions, anything?
A crazy parallel in my head between my 4-year-old son and the environment I'm trying to provide him with discipline and what may be lacking for a lot of these folks that are committing these offenses. It almost seems like we're creating a quasi-parenting model, and all they want at the end of the day is to be felt.
So I think that's very right. It's much worse than that, right? What the system represents is the worst kind of parenting. Because what all the child psychologists will tell you is if you want to create a psychopath, bombard people with unpredictable rewards and punishments because they will drive themselves crazy trying to figure it out. And what the probation officers doing this have discovered, people will say, I really like you, we're not going to give the sanction this time. And what the surveys with the supervisees say is, he doesn't care and respect me enough to keep his word. They don't like it, all right? So obviously everybody here is getting this. When I used to do a lot of public speaking about this, I'd say, if we did crime if we raised dogs the way we did crime, you'd bring the puppy home, you would introduce it into the living room, and it would soil the rug. And you would wait 3 days, and you would say to the dog, we don't do that here, don't do that again. And then it would soil the rug again, and this time you would wait 5 days, and you would say, I really mean it, don't do that here, don't do that again. And the next time you wouldn't do anything. And then the 15th time, you take the dog out and shoot it in the head and bury it under the cherry tree and go to your neighbor and say, these dogs today have no respect for authority. I gave him so many chances, right? That's actually the way we've been doing this stuff. And right now, nobody really knows how to change this for the whole system, but we can change it in bits. And when you do that, it's very effective.
Because when you're consistent, they know what the rules are, they know what the consequences are. You say don't do X, Y, Z, and they do it, and you're right there on them to stop them from doing it. They haven't had that.
Dog trainers, to stick with this again, have this precept which is be the tree. And it's very interesting. If you're teaching a dog to heel, they will struggle with you up and down the street. If you take the same dog and the same leash and tie it to a tree, they don't struggle. They know they're not going to win.
Right.
Right? And what we see as sensitivity and discretion, the dog sees as maybe I'm going to get away with it.
So this is similar. This is similar to what we're training teachers and deans and principals, assistant principals in Chicago to
Is it?
Right, because the problem has been that a kid acts out in class,
Right.
disrupts class, and the teacher has to choose between, do I continue educating the other kids, or do I deal with this problem, right? And in that short amount of time, teacher doesn't have time to sort of social work what the issue is, right?
Right.
So most often they choose to continue teaching, right? But the message then to that kid, to that young person is that if I act out, I will get away with it.
Yep.
And so what we have been trying to get teachers and administrators to do is to do swift and certain sanctions, small privileges. And my favorite phrase is, if you burn school time, school burns your time. And it works.
And the beauty of this, I mean, be the tree sounds vicious, right? And what saves it is you're not sending them away for 20 years. It doesn't have to be big, but it has to be transparent, legitimate, predictable, all those things. So that's really interesting. Okay, it turns out that you don't necessarily even have to apply sanction, because it has now become clear, both through practice and evaluation research, that simply telling people what their situation is can be extremely meaningful. The clearest evidence on this is in experiments aimed at letting felons know that they are exposed to the federal gun laws. So if you are a felon, you cannot possess a firearm. If you are found in possession of a firearm, the federal mandatory minimum begins with 5 years in federal prison. You serve at least 85% of your time, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons can send you anywhere in the country. It is the nature of being one of these guys that they can be walking around, they are eligible for the law, the PD can be concerned about them, and they can be having their names bandied about in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they have no idea that any of that is right until they get collared and they get 5 years. So the logical question was, let's tell them. And it turns out that that makes a dramatic difference. It doesn't have to be heavy-duty federal law. It's turning out the same thing works for state. It doesn't have to be a heightened legal sanction. It can simply be, you and your friends have been going through the revolving door. You're not going to anymore. We've decided that you're special. There's a bell that's going to ring when you get arrested the next time. We want you to know that. Anthony Braga in Boston, who was part of the original Boston team, has done research in Boston on subsequent ceasefire sort of interventions. And he has looked at the impact of an actual full house law enforcement crackdown on a gang versus somebody simply going to them and saying, everybody's paying attention to you, you'd better stop. If you don't stop, something's going to happen. Both of them work. The warnings work as or almost as well as the actual crackdowns. And the warnings cost nothing, get nobody locked up, establish that the authorities actually would like people not to go to jail, all those sorts of things. But letting people know what their exposure is can be independently effective.
I have a question. What about the duration of the effect? I assume you're measuring that?
We're not that good at that yet, because the nature of these evaluations is that you have to get them done, which means typically the impact is being measured for a couple of years on either side of the intervention. There are different answers for different versions, and we really don't know what the kind of underlying principles are. What we know right now is that you get impact. We know that what the literature calls informal social control, what you think, what your girlfriend thinks, what your mom thinks, what your minister thinks, what the standards are in your community have a lot of influence on what you do. I spent years trying to get narcotics and gang cops to believe this. They absolutely did not believe that anything except basically getting killed or sent away to federal prison would get these guys' attention. I finally came up with a test that kind of got the point across. It works just as well for the general public. So raise your hand if when you were growing up you were afraid of the police. Raise your hand if when you were growing up you were afraid of your mother. You have just learned everything there is to know about informal social control.
I guess I was sort of afraid of
Of
police.
the police. But what's really interesting is lots more people are afraid of people who aren't the police than of people who are the police. And if the question is, when you were growing up, who did you respect, the police or your mother, you get even bigger divergences, right? People mostly do what the people around them think is appropriate, which is why networks of criminal offenders get in such trouble. Right? Bad friends will get you to do bad things. That's what criminology calls differential association. Your friends get you in hot water. We can focus that kind of community pressure just like we focus law enforcement or job training programs or anything else. When we know who this small number of special guys is, we can find people in the neighborhood who they respect. And they respect lots of people. They may not respect the people we want them to respect. They may not respect the mayor or the police chief, but they respect the elder on the block, the OG, who they looked up to when they were coming up, the girl that they want to go out with next time you want to.
Okay, so they all fear their mother, or you hope that they do, because most people fear their mother. And you know, hear cases, I mean, I don't know anybody living that are in groups or whatever, so I don't know. But most of them have mothers at home,
Yep.
and they leave home to go do what they're doing, and the mother, maybe she doesn't even know what he's doing. She just knows he's out hanging with his friends.
So the most interesting thing about this is not to ask the mothers what they think. It's to ask the guys what they think, right? We're trying to get their attention. It's their behavior that they care about. And what they will say over and over and over and over again is, I was taught better. I knew what I was doing was wrong. My mom worked 3 jobs. She was doing exactly the right thing. She couldn't have eyes on me all the time. I ran with my friends and I did really stupid stuff.
Okay.
Right? So we assume that because they're out of control, that they don't care what their community thinks and that their community thinks that what they're doing is okay. And neither one of those things is right. What this does is, remember I was saying, you know, ordinary law enforcement doesn't work either.
Right.
You got to focus it. By definition in these neighborhoods, ordinary social control isn't working. You got to focus it. And you can focus it. You can create those, you can find those sources of influence. You don't have to create them. They're always there. And you can create these circumstances in which you get a very heavy dose of that on the people who need to hear it. So you can have 1,000 people doing a vigil, a march after a homicide, but the 7 guys in the community who really need to hear that aren't there.
Right.
You get 5% of those people in a room with those 7 guys, now you're in business, right? So that's what this is about.
Okay.
And they respect the mothers of murdered children, they respect the reformed gang members. Susan has made an art form of this in Los Angeles. And I'll tell you my single favorite moment in all of this, in all my years of doing this. In North Carolina, one of these older, wiser gang members stood up and said, so when you get locked up the next time, how long do you think it's going to be before one of your boys, one of your street soldier, got my back brothers, sleeps with your girlfriend? And this kid raised his hand and he said, 3 days, and it was my cousin. Right? They know this stuff. but nobody creates these moments. So you can create these moments.
David, just a quick question or comment. When we talked a few weeks ago, you mentioned something that was fascinating, that one of the messages that seems to be resonating with these groups is that what they're doing is putting their younger siblings
Yes.
at risk. And I thought you might elaborate on that.
Everybody loves somebody. I mean, the baseline expectation that lots of people outside these communities, and still unfortunately lots of people in law enforcement, has is these guys are sociopaths. That's why they do what they do. There are a few. There aren't very many. And for all practical purposes, every gang member, every one of these guys, he loves his mother, he'd like to love his father, maybe he does love his father, he loves his little brother and sister. They will say, you know, look at what we're selling drugs, we're shooting guns, you know, look the little kids running around, right? They'll say that themselves. We used to get these, how do you create a new morality in the community? You don't need to create a new morality. People know this is wrong. You've just got to bring that to the surface. So, many of you have heard this already this morning because we were talking about it. But anybody who wants to get out of this mess and change their life, we should help them do it. We're not that good at that when it comes to the most exceptional street guys and the expectation that we have, that we want them to become middle-class citizens with, you know, paying jobs with benefits. Our capacity to help them move from where they are to there is very poor. But I don't want to dwell on this too much because many of you have heard it already. If we say all the time, we'll meet you where you are, and then we don't do it. If we really meet them where they are, they have people trying to kill them, right? We can protect them from that. There's no food on the table. These guys mostly live like one step above homeless people. They're not getting rich. They don't have Range Rovers. They've got no money in the bank. They're desperate. Nobody lives anywhere. You stay at, right? They do love their little brothers and sisters, and there's no food on the table. There's no point in getting a job because child support will take everything you've got. All this, you've got no ID, right? So there are absolutely ways that we can build bridges to the most desperate guys in ways that make sense to them. And we should do everything we can to do that.
Just quick on that one. Has anyone tried to plug people into kind of gray market off books work? I mean, lots of people are working
Right.
in these neighborhoods. The auto body, the car repair that's unlicensed, the beauty salon they've had at somebody's house. Like,
Right.
has anyone tried to? I mean, it's obviously couldn't be a government-sponsored program, but we'll help you out. But these informal
It'll be like
networks,
this.
These informal economies that are out there, we know are out there.
So, you know, in LA, we train gang intervention workers who are, many of them are step just out of the gang. And so, spend 144 hours training them. Probably, I would say, a good 30, 40 hours of that is on personal development, which is, can you show up on time? Can you dress properly? Can you fill out your timesheets and do all that stuff? And many of those guys are actually volunteering in gang intervention agencies rather than actually taking a job, because we feel like regardless of what job you take, if you can't get the personal development stuff in line, then you're just not successful. So personal development, and then there's a healing and trauma component, because this is when we bring in a psychologist and we have a closed door session about the exposure to trauma, and there's sometimes breakdowns, and people just been living, and it may not even be about trauma because of gang violence, it's trauma in the home.
And
It comes through others.
criminal
So,
justice.
Yeah, and then, or guilt about not having protected their little brother from violence at home or whatever. So there's a lot of steps that folks have to go through before they can get to whether it's a gray market or a regular mainstream job. And so there were lots of attempts of getting these guys into, for example, labor union jobs. And really, many of those didn't work out because you didn't do these other steps of getting the folks ready.
And the other way of answering your question is one that most everybody really doesn't like, especially people who are really committed to this outreach and support mission, which is they are in gray market economies before they show up, and they're in gray market economies after they leave. They're already making money, right? These guys are not starving. What everybody wants is for them to turn their lives around, and most of them don't. They're hustling before and they're hustling after, but they're not killing people, they're not shooting people. You don't have to have the violence associated with the crime. And people think either you keep on running and gunning or you become a labor union member. It's completely unrealistic. Most everybody stays in the middle, but the violence goes way, way, way down. And all of this works, and this was again one of the most central elements of this completely unexpected Boston approach. It works through usually, often, repeated face-to-face communication. This is not the system sending signals. This is us in a room talking to you and saying, here's what's going on. We're in your living room, when you're in your mother's living room. All of these pieces of outreach need to contain, we believe anyway, each of the three planks. You got to know what's coming in terms of consequences. You've got to know what the community wants, and you've got to know that we want to help you and what it is. The call-ins have now been done all over the country. We've added to it what we call a custom notification, which is your group is beefing with this group. We know what's going on. We know that you're the impact player on this side. We know that this other guy's the impact player on the other side. We are going to have a face-to-face conversation with you and your family about what's going on. And again, we're going to be able to give you individualized attention on each of these three planks. The more we learn about the role of procedural justice and legitimacy, the more we bend over backwards to be respectful, to be supportive, to explain why this is going on. There is a world of difference between saying to somebody, I'm going to tell you this, but you're a knucklehead, we don't think you're going to listen, and it's fine if you get yourself locked up. I'm the chief of police and you're going to be putting my kids through college, which I have heard people say. And on the other hand, saying your entire community has mobilized to keep you alive and out of prison because we can't stand you failing on either side. The objective elements of the intervention may be exactly the same. The communication and the tone and the context are very, very, very different.
Can I ask you a question? So does it matter in your mind who does the communication? So it sounds, it could be, this group call-in, which has happened before, where there's kind of the sanctions, the moral voice, and whatnot, or lots of gang intervention folks do this one-on-one.
They all,
Do you
absolutely.
think it matters?
We don't know. I mean, I've got thoughts, but they're just my thoughts. What we think we've learned about this stuff is, and when I was just getting started in this and people said, aren't you terrified out there? Or how do you get people to talk to you? And the answer is no. And if you treat people with respect, they'll talk to you. And I think it's no different on this one. We've got thoughts that it's better if it's somebody from one's own background, ideally from one's own neighborhood, but we don't know. And people on the outreach workers, well, they have to have been in the life. Well, we know that's not true. There are lots of people who are great outreach workers who've never been locked up. So I just don't know.
I know you said a lot of people don't get out. for those few who have got out, is there a profile you develop, the older guy, the younger guy, the guy in the middle? Who is most likely to get out, or do you not have that?
We've got a sense, and the sense is definitely that, you know, the older and more tired you are, the more likely you're going to move out. But that's always been true. You know, the literature on aging out used to be that by the time you hit your late 20s, nobody was a gang member anymore. That's not true anymore. People stay in it a long time, but it's clearly very different dealing with somebody who's 28 or 34, they've been through the mill, all of their friends are dead, they've been in and out and all that kind of stuff, and somebody who's 21 and still having fun. That's different. And this should be obvious, but it's not. You got to do what you say. Don't say anything you're not going to do. These guys expect, again, to be lied to. They have unbelievable bullshit detectors. Keep it simple, keep it honest, and stay on track. More of these interventions have been destroyed by the people who get paid to do the work, saying, well, this guy's not listening to me, but they've all got younger brothers, so let's go try to do remedial education with their younger brothers. And we're not very good at that, and the older guys can still keep killing each other. Right? This is narrow, surgical, focused stuff, and that's why it works. Not very important for this conversation. There's lots and lots and lots of data and accountability stuff that should go on. This is important. There is a tremendous impulse for people to start out saying, we are going to keep people from killing each other, and 18 months later say, none of them have jobs, they're a failure, and we're a failure. Everything except going to prison and shooting somebody or getting shot doesn't count in terms of outcomes. Everything else, you track it in 67 different ways. They are outputs, activities, not outcomes. We don't expect everybody to get arrested, and if they don't, that's fine. We don't expect everybody to get a job. We're not happy if they don't, but if the gunplay stops, that's fine. This is crime prevention, community safety stuff. And then, and I'll stop here and we'll just use whatever time we have left for anything you want. This has now been mapped onto lots of different substantive problems. This is the gang violence intervention. You can shut drug markets down. In Chicago, they've shown that it works with individual violent offenders. In Chicago, it was gun offenders. That's worked in other settings with others. Swift, certain, and fair is what the probation intervention that we're talking about is now being called. There's a panel later on in this conference. It is apparently working with serious domestic violence offenders. There's very good results on early prison management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 24/7 is kind of interesting. It's chronic drunk drivers. And in 24/7, if you are an incorrigible drunk driver, you are sentenced to come to a day reporting center every day, and I think every evening. Alcohol does not linger in your body, so you can't urine test for it. You have to blow into a tube. If you've been drinking, you get a short sanction. It's creating almost 100% compliance amongst this recidivist population. And what's fascinating about it is that 50% of that reduction persists after people are no longer under supervision. It somehow helps them reset their behavior. But here's the point. Began with the idea that lots and lots and lots of core public safety stuff presents in the same way, small numbers of high-rate people. There has evolved a way of intervening with that population. It's now got good evidence or field experience in a bunch of different ways. And literally the last thing I will say, Susan Herman from NYPD is here. Susan has been managing the difficulties associated with the costume panhandlers, which began in Hollywood and have now infected the rest of the country. We've got Gumby and Superman and stuff like that bothering people in Times Square. They've controlled that problem in this way through direct outreach, and of course we call them costumed notifications. So that's that, and we've got about 5 minutes, so over to you.
I'm relatively new to our BRAVE program, and I'm part of LSU, so it's the academic side of it. But it's been my perception, looking at the data, that they were really successful at identifying the groups. They had a major crackdown, they disrupted the groups, but now it seems like after this major disruption, that they're having a hard time getting a beat on exactly what the groups look like now. And I wondered if that was kind of the life cycle of how this process works, that once you have this disruption, that there's kind of some chaos, and how do they group back together? Is it younger kids that start picking up where the older people left off?
That's totally normal. The group scene is near chaos. And one of the things that kept people from seeing the empirical picture on the ground that I started with is that in law enforcement and scholarship and mayor's offices, people look for gangs. And the gang is in people's mind. It's organized, it's purposeful, it's got leadership. And you look around the world, and even in LA, that's greatly less true than people think it is. And almost everywhere else, it's not true at all. And so looking for gangs means you miss this. When you're just looking at what's going on the street, I say to people, don't think General Motors, think Sandlot baseball. It comes, it goes, people are part of one group, part of another group, they move around, they disappear, they reform, exactly what you're talking about. And there are ways to stay on top of it, but it means constant, near constant monitoring. And it's just a different way of thinking about the problem. If you look for the persistence and the organization and the hierarchy, it's almost never there.
In looking at the requirements, the limitations, is part of it is that you are removing the anonymity that they have within their community?
We think so, yeah. So one thing that all these guys think is that they're flying under the radar. And one of the reasons they think that is because nothing's happening to them. And they judge from that nobody knows, because if they know, they would do something. And this is exacerbated when people in law enforcement do what people in law enforcement do, and they stand up and they say, I know you. I know your big brother, I know your mother, I know your girlfriend, I know where she parks her car, I know everything you do. And you think, he thinks, you think, well, I'm getting away with everything, right? So they're letting me, which is what a lot of these guys really do think. They think that we are all powerful, we can do anything we want, and if people are getting away with it, it's because we approve of it, or even worse, we're supporting the drug trade and all that stuff that flows into the conspiracy theories and all that sort of thing. They're not nearly as anonymous as they think, but the way we behave reinforces that. And so, yes, we think countering that makes a difference.
Then I have one last question. With the police department, how do you get the police departments and police officers to buy into this?
It's really, I used to spend half my life worrying about that. Not anymore. This is not radical insurgent stuff anymore. And those of us who help agencies do this, we can't keep up with the demand right now. Getting people to want to do it is no longer the issue. And when somebody says, the opposition used to be this grinding, depressed, we're different, it won't work here, you're a moron, you don't know the streets, that kind of thing. That's not what we're dealing with anymore. Now when somebody says, I really don't believe this, or I don't, Moritz now, I don't really get how that's going to work. We'll answer their question, but then we'll have them call their peer in LA or South Bend or New York or Chicago, and one of their own will walk them through it. And that's part of why this stuff is mushrooming like this.
So I do the outreach and support. That's what I do for this model. And so I find that because I'm already in the community and I do anti-violence work, it's easier for me to do the outreach and support.
Yeah.
Because it's what I already do. But what I find is that when I go to the houses, because they give me a list of people who they identify, and when I go out, what I find is that they think I work for the police. And so having to, balance that piece out and let them know I'm not an agent of the police, but what I am is the support for
Yep.
you, to keep you off of the screen, to keep you, out of their radar. And so that engagement, so I have to do 3 and 4 visits before I can even get to the conversation.
Yeah, and so there's a particular version of this issue. So I'm not sure if everybody heard, but the comment was, I'm doing this work in Newark. I represent the outreach and support side of this. And when I'm given a list of names by law enforcement, I go start to do my work, they think I work for the cops. Right, so there's that issue with anybody in your role. There's a special version of this issue for people who do outreach and interruption work, who also work with police. All of that can be negotiated, but it's really important and it needs to be. And underlying that, and you know this, but it's probably one of those things that you've known for so long, like the rest of us, you've forgotten when you didn't know it. But when you're with especially these guys, they think everybody's law enforcement.
Right.
They think the teachers are law enforcement. They think the mailman's law enforcement. I mean, they really do.
Right.
It's just them, right? And working, that's a real issue.
It's have an opportunity to be on the ground, which is the most effective component that I can really speak to. One of the ways that I see that a lot of kids is is being won over is because you have the conditions that you have, like we were talking about earlier, about the homelessness, about the ability of the art of persuasion of money, and these kids is getting involved at a very young age, but it's like how can you juggle the fact that when you have the country see how not all but a lot of corrupt law enforcement officers and the kids flip side is that I'm gonna go with this set or this set because that set, the law enforcement set is corrupt. Like, how can you balance between, when I'm telling him that, based on my experience that, this is the correct way, that's not the correct way, and it's very difficult in today's time, especially with all the corruption and all the pressure that goes
So
on.
this is a place, so again, the question, that the comment was, the observation, and I think it's absolutely right, that one of the ways one of the things that makes it hard to do this work is that when you say to people, do the right thing, they will point to cops and politicians and Ollie North and all that sort of thing. They're way worse than I am. And A, that may be right, and B, only the community can then say, don't care. Not talking about them, talking about you, talking about this community. This is how this community wants to behave. And the fact that they're doing wrong doesn't mean that it's okay for you to do wrong. And you're not hearing that from the cops or the judge or the mayor. You're hearing it from us.
Which have a lot of impact.
It has a huge amount of impact.
But, yeah.
But the other thing I'd say is we look at those dynamics and we tend to go to a place in our minds where we're saying, which means all of the kids, all of the young men are going to go sour. And let's go back to where we began, which is under the worst of conditions, almost nobody in the worst neighborhoods will ever shoot anybody. Very few people actually cross that line. It's not everybody, it's not most people, and one of the ways that those who do go there justify what they do, and there's literature on this actually that's really interesting in the gang world, going back to the 30s. People have always done this. And I've got an academic response to it, but the real response is, I call bullshit. Not having it. Not working. End of that conversation. Right? You're going to do the right thing. We here are going to do the right thing. And the fact is, most of these guys really respond to that. Kevin, are you giving me a high sign? No? Okay. Anything else?
David, as I envision us going forward and thinking of our teams, I hear sometimes us, them, and within our own organization, our own circle of responsibility. And so we have the street team that is not a part of the police department. And so therefore, that competing thought exists versus saying that this outreach program has to have a police officer component. The criminal justice system has to be represented to actually be valued as a trusted partner in this relationship. And I think sometimes the way I looked at the way we did it in Pittsburgh the first time, it was that everybody operated on their own island.
Yeah.
But correlated with each other just in the meeting sense. So when we sat in a room, we talked about what we did, but in practice, we never approached it in that
Right.
manner. So having the officers with the outreach team, so that you see, now you're trusting me as a police officer as well. It's somebody from a different environment, different background, that has a different authority, but still cares.
So let's just admit that the first Pittsburgh round was a disaster, and
Horrific.
a disaster, and not worry about how that happened because it didn't happen right, right? So that's just, we all know that. I think what we all have come to believe about this is that there needs to be one logic, one script, and that all the different partners and all the different moving pieces need to be in harness according to that. That doesn't mean that street workers need to know what the narcotics undercovers are doing, or that cops need to walk with street workers, or that everybody has to live in everybody's vest pocket. There have to be appropriate working relationships, very carefully structured. It does all have to hang together. But I will tell you from my own experience that in most circumstances, if a cop is walking with an outreach worker, at least at the beginning of one of these things, neither one of them is going to get their job done. And that's just not the right obligation to feel at the outset. Should there be a way of maintaining structured and appropriate relations between the police department and outreach? Yes. Figuring out what that is something that people have now spent pretty close to their lives on, and there are good answers to it. But total, open, full transparency is probably not it.
Sporting events is, I think, one of the key effective ways in which law enforcement.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Sporting events.
Sporting events.
It's one of the most effective ways that I've seen, with outreach workers bringing the community, and then law enforcement having a segment of individuals, and we have a basketball game or a baseball game.
Could be.